Hi, we're talking about post-colonial literature today, and we'll take a look at Zadie Smith's short story, The Waiter's Wife. I start with a quote from the Norton Anthology that I think is helpful to get us started thinking about post-colonialism. In winning a war, World War II in this case, Great Britain lost an empire. So what is post-colonial literature? I think that Norton describes it well when talking about the decolonization of the British Empire after World War II. They write, British post-war decolonization coincided with and encouraged the efflorescence of post-colonial writing that would bring the most dramatic geographic shift in literature in English since its inception. Writers from Britain's former colonies published influential and innovative novels, plays, and poems, hybridizing their local traditions and varieties of English with those of the empire. And I think the key emphasis here is this shift in English literature since its inception. So think back to when we started this course and we talked about how Chaucer, the moment when he became sort of the solidification of English as the language of literature, and it came through loud and clear in his voice. Well, this is the same sort of significant moment when the influx of cultures and languages from the previously held British colonies began to shift the nature of British literature. And I don't want to imply that this was a painless shift, but it was certainly profound for literature. So profound that we have a great number of Nobel Prize winners from the post-colonial authors. Wole Soyinka, Nadine Gordimer, Derek Walcott, V.S. Naipaul, J.M. Coetzee, and Doris Lessing all represent different colonial experiences under the British Empire. So let's talk a little bit about some of the features of post-colonial literature. We won't have time to go over all of them. I just want to touch on 4 of them, and then we'll take a look at the story and see if we can find some parallels. Hybridity is, I think, the most important term when we're thinking about post-colonial literature. I asked you to take a look at John Lye's handout on post-colonial literature, and he puts it well when he says the term hybrid refers to the concept of hybridity, an important concept in post-colonial theory, referring to the integration or mingling of cultural signs and practices from the colonizing and the colonized cultures. And then he goes on to emphasize something that I think is very important as we think about post-colonial literature in general. This integration, he says, may be too orderly a word to represent the variety of stratagems, desperate or cunning or good-willed, by which people adapt themselves to the necessities and opportunities of more or less oppressive or invasive cultural impositions, live into alien cultural patterns through their own structures of understanding, thus producing something familiar but new. And so he touches on there the fact that integration makes it sound tidy, but this is an outpouring of response to the colonial experience. And the colonial experience was not gentle and it was not benign. And so naturally there's an extraordinary amount of anger and pain and all kinds of other human emotions mixed in this. But what we find in literature is something very new and important for British literature. Another feature is the appropriation or adaptation of the colonizer's language. Many post-colonial authors went ahead and just took on the English language as it was. But many also deliberately play with English, remolding it to reflect the rhythms and syntax of indigenous languages, and they're inventing new words and styles to demonstrate mastery of a language that was, in a sense, forced upon them, or you could say more dramatically, that was used to oppress them. And this comes from the University of Wisconsin-Madison handout that I've linked to our course page. And so this appropriation and adaptation of language is an important feature of post-colonial literature, and we'll see it in Smith's work. Also, the idea of asserting cultural integrity. Often post-colonial literature addresses the colonizers' suppression of indigenous cultural practices by exploring the richness and value of that indigenous culture. So where in colonial times, say, religious practices in the Muslim religion may have been silenced or forbidden by the British oppressors, you might see that then coming forward after decolonization and being privileged in the literature. However, it also is always exploring the hybridity that emerges from the blending of mixed cultures, so that sort of strict Muslim celebration never exists in and of itself without the influence of that colonial experience. And then one other point, postcolonial literature reflects an exploration of cultural identity, and generally that's a mixed identity, whether it's literally mixing of races or mixing of experience. Always positioned as the other by the colonial power, the indigenous people of a country find their postcolonial identity is always by necessity complicated by the history of colonization. So postcolonial authors will play with notions of identity to reveal cultural influence, bias, and blending. Because once you have lived under a colonial power that has oppressed your culture, your culture can never be pure and simply the same, even if you try to erase that colonial experience. So that's another feature of the writing. Okay, let's talk a little about Zadie Smith. She was born in London. Her father was English and her mother was Jamaican. She grew up in Willesden, which is a working class community in North London that's very much a rich mix of cultures. And it's the setting of this story, but it's also the setting of a lot of her writing. She has written 4 novels. Her first and most celebrated, perhaps, is called White Teeth, was published in 2000. The Autograph Man was published in 2002. On Beauty was in 2005, and in 2012 she published a novel called NW, standing for Northwest, a part of London. The following description of her work from the Norton, I think, is most apt. Before its publication, no work had captured with such humor and zest the multicultural jangle of different peoples, dialects, and styles in contemporary Britain. And the reason I think this is apt is particularly because of this emphasis on humor and zest. I think that Zadie Smith, coming at a time of a sort of a second wave of postcolonial authors, she was born in London. She's the child of one immigrant and one native Londoner. She doesn't have quite the anger and political rage or didacticism of earlier writers who necessarily needed to speak out. Wole Soyinka or Chinua Achebe or other writers who were first-generation postcolonial writers necessarily wrote with a lot of insightful rage. But there's a lot of humor and zest, as the Norton describes it in her writing, that I think is also valuable. So let's talk about The Waiter's Wife. The story includes scenes and characters that appeared in her first novel, White Teeth. And this excerpt from the Norton captures the flavor and world of this story. This is a world of often surprising interchanges between East and West, raucous debates between secularism and religion and gender, cross-cultural friendships and marriages that blur the dividing lines among Asians, Caribbeans, Jews, the English, and many others. And again, I think what's important here is the variety of experience that blends in her story and in her novels. So the central characters give us a sense of this blending or this variety. Samad Iqbal is a Bangladeshi who fought in World War II for the British, where he became good friends with Archie Jones, who's an Englishman from London, who also fought in World War II for the British. So they're of an older generation in addition to being from different locations. Ahsana Iqbal is the much younger wife of Samad, and she's an observant Bengali Muslim. Clara Jones is the much younger wife of Archie, and she is from Jamaica, and as we learn in the story, flirting with feminism of the 1970s. And then there's other characters. Nina is Alsana's niece, Ardashir Mukal is Samad's cousin, and Saul Josephowicz is the Jewish park keeper. So again, there's a huge social variety here brought together. So what post-colonial themes do we see at work? As I said earlier, I think hybridity is the most important overarching theme in post-colonial literature, but particularly in this story. So as the characters emerge in this story, we see various ways they have to navigate the blending of cultural traditions. So language is hybrid in this story, relationships are hybrid or blended, characters are navigating the blended or hybrid nature of their identities in the setting of 1975 London. Let's look at this. Language, for example. Look at the way that Smith highlights the pronunciation of Indian dishes by the diners who visit the restaurant where Samad works. Samad says, listening to the appalling pronunciation of British, Spanish, American, French, Australian. Go by Elo Sog, please. Chicken jail fret C, with chips, thanks. So notice how Smith is able to capture not only the mispronunciation of the British, but she includes Spanish, American, other cultures. But that's the mispronunciation of the Indian, but also she's highlighting a dialect from London when she has with, the mispronunciation of with chips, thanks. So she's playing with language rather than critiquing. She's noticing all of the variety that comes together, and in this case visits this one Indian restaurant. Or another example of language is when Alsana creates a sort of blend of her native Indian patterns and English. Alsana is outraged. Repression? Nonsense, silly billy word. And the footnote in the book points to that word, silly billy, reads, here, as elsewhere, Alsana mimics the reduplication common in South Asian languages. So I would ask you to think about, what does this hybrid language reveal? Is it a critique of South Asian language patterns? Is it a critique of Nina's way of speaking? Or is it a new language that gives Alsana a unique voice and power as she blends her traditional language patterns with English as she's trying to occupy her new world, London? There's other hybridities too. Hybrid relationships. Archie is British, Clara is Jamaican. Archie is old, Clara is young. Clara and Alsana. Clara is Jamaican, Alsana is from Bengal. Archie and Samad, best friends, but from very different worlds. Or the three friends on the park bench being visited by the Jewish park keeper. There are so many ways, so many permutations where we see these hybrid, and sometimes the narrator will point out to us how odd they appear, how different. Also, relationships are blended. If you think about each of these, they're each sort of hybrid. And this reflects post-colonial London in 1975. Or notice the way the characters are coping with the blended quality of their identity. Certainly we see Alsana struggling with that as she tries to live in London and make sense of it all. But I think each of the characters is struggling with that. And then I just have some questions for you to think about, and I'll ask them on the discussion board. What other post-colonial features or themes do you see at work in this story? Are certain characters asserting the integrity of their home culture, even as they seek to have power in this new setting? And if so, how are they doing that? What other ways can you identify Smith playing with the language of the colonizer, or the language of the colonized for that matter? How is the text allowing the complexity and non-reducible nature of the post-colonial experience to remain in this text? That is, how does she not make it appear to be just one thing? Because, of course, the post-colonial experience is as diverse as the cultures that were colonized or as the individuals who experienced it. Or another question would be, how is Smith exploring the various forms and participants in prejudice? Because certainly no one cultural group comes in for critique. Everyone is highlighted in their unique prejudices. And then, very importantly, certainly not last, how is gender a part of this narrative critique of dominant cultures? Because it is very much a part of this story, though it may seem more subtle. Okay, I really look forward to talking about this novel with you on the discussion board. Thanks.